So, welcome to Grail Country. This is an episode that I actually have been looking forward to for a long time. My guest today is Marcus Shera. He is a PhD student in economics. He has a YouTube channel called The Economic Playground. And when we met each other in at the DC event that featured Michael Martin, Paul Vanderclay, and Spencer Clavin, we got to talking and had an interesting conversation. And I told him that I'd had Bulgakov's Philosophy of Economy sitting on my Kindle for a long time, and I've been wanting to get someone to talk to about it with because Bulgakov is very complex and it's good to have conversation partners as you're reading Bulgakov. So I didn't want to just read it on my own. I wanted to read it with someone and have a dialogue partner. And Marcus immediately showed interest, and so we said we were going to do this. We're going to just we'll see at the pace. This is Bulgakov is very his text here is very dense. I'm not sure what pace we'll get through it, but Marcus and I have both read it, and Marcus is a economics student. He's taken lots of notes, so I'm going to kind of let him take the lead here in this conversation, and I'll just bounce stuff off him. So Marcus, with that said, what was the first thing that grabbed you about this? And maybe and let me frame it this way. What was the first thing that grabbed you about this in comparison to books on economy or philosophy of economy that you read in the past? And what was your impression of it?
Well, one of the economics thinkers that I've been very influenced by, her books are right up on the top shelf here, is Deirdre McCloskey. And she's sort of, in the last 10 years or so, been pioneering a sort of a way to try to look at economics that centers humans and human virtue, right? So not
Mm-hmm.
just thinking of people as rational utility maximizers. She calls, like, as a colloquial character, Max U is this character that economists have in their head of someone that's just going around trying to maximize all of their goals and not thinking of them as a full human living in a full world and what that would mean for the study of economics, right? Or the study of people in their economic life. And Bulgakov is really pointing out that economics is having this trend in that direction way earlier than many other people are pointing that out. That doesn't mean that all of economics started in that position. Someone like Adam Smith has a much fuller, richer understanding of a human person, right? But by the time that Marx hits, and by the time that Bentham is already very dominant in people's minds, Max U is like the main character in people's minds for economics. So the word that he uses in the first chapter to describe kind of what he's arguing against, he calls it the economistic worldview or economism, right?
Yes.
Which for people familiar with this little corner and all that, this kind of stuff, a very simple way to explain that would be something like economism is the social science analog to scientism or to materialism,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
So
that's
what materialism is
mhm.
for the physical sciences or metaphysics, economism is for social life, so for analyzing social systems. This is the materialistic way of looking at that. Everything is about people's base biological needs and then their complete tunnel vision to obtain
Yeah,
those
like those
needs.
things, it's also a monocular vision that thinks it can just explain everything through this one
Yes.
rubric
Yeah.
and misses out on the complexity. Yeah.
And so in economics, sometimes we call that economic imperialism, right? Where sociologists say, oh, we explain these social behavior through this method. Psychologists say through this method. Economists say, no, we can explain it with rational constraints maximizing behavior, right? And so we can conquer their explanation of this behavior with our toolkit. In some domains, I'm partial to that view, just in the sense that I think economics is broader than people realize. But that doesn't mean that you actually have to think of people that way or that you need to exclude those other ways of
Well, and
thought.
actually, and as we go through this, we'll see that ultimately Bulgakov's view of economy is quite broad and
Yes,
encompassing. It's just that what he's trying to avoid doing is to break it up into simplistic explanations. And he's like
yes, yes,
wanting us to hold some polarities and tension.
yes. And I guess that this is my first time reading Bulgakov, so you're going to be sort of my guide through exactly the way he thinks or what the ways he used various terms. But his sort of response is when he comes up with his own definition of economy, he says something like he wants to center it with studying a life. What is a life in contrast to death? Why the death seems like it should be the natural state. Random events are just affecting each other. Why is there any harmony or order to anything? The fact that there are stable, living, vital systems is the mystery that needs to be explained in some sense. Um, And so what economy is the struggle of life against death. The fact that death or these random forces looking out to destroy or to limit something are constantly pushing up against some particular example of life. And the fact that life is able to be stable nevertheless is the mystery that sort of the study of an economy is trying to explain, something like that. And
Well,
whether that's
actually,
for an individual or a collective.
I think I actually may have snipped. Hold on a second here, see if I can find it. I actually may have snipped his definition of economy earlier today. Okay,
I
here.
know I counted it in here too.
Okay, this isn't necessarily his. Actually, it is, because he ends up giving a definition of economy that ties back to labor, but he does it in a way that's very different from the object-oriented notion of labor that Marxism has. He says this here, and I think this is from chapter 3, I think. Thus, the living connection between subject and object, the bridge leading the I into the world of realities, and irrevocably connecting him to this world, is labor. Human reality objectivized anew, and thus objectivizing the world for us. Thanks to labor, there can be no subject alone, as subjective idealism would have it, nor any object alone, as
Mhm.
materialism holds, but only their living unity, the subject object. And only when we inspect its one or another aspect by means of methodological abstraction do a subject and an object separate out from it. This polarity or duality of being is extinguished only in the absolute, which is simultaneously subject and object for itself. This is why the subject's coming out of itself into the object is by definition excluded for it, and the subject objectness is postulated in the single identical timeless act, the mystery of the Holy Trinity and intertrinitarian life. So he relates the idea of economy in terms of human economy
Yeah.
directly to the economy of the Blessed Trinity.
Yeah, because you hear sometimes in theology people talking about a divine economy or something like that, or the
Mm-hmm.
economy of the Holy Spirit. Sometimes I've heard people use,
Yep.
and then you ask why, and they go, "Oh, well, common Greek roots, just words end up the same. It's not. It doesn't have anything to do with whatever you're studying." But or in the church context, sometimes we say the priest uses economy in a
Yep.
particular instance of not bending a rule, but saying, "Oh, it doesn't apply in this case," and something like that, right? But
Yeah. But
it's
well,
awesome to
ultimately,
mix
the
those things.
vision of economy that Bulgakov is building towards in this text is the vision of economy that is the world as the household of God. Like that is
Hmm.
ultimately his vision for economy.
Yeah.
Like, and although he's not suggesting that we try to like um implement this in a utopian way. That's not what he's doing at all.
Hmm.
But he's saying that like that is always the thing that we're moving toward.
Hmm.
So
And I'll just say I found another spot where he defines economy. So let me
okay,
just
go
read
for it.
that quick. He says, this is on page 72. The struggle against the antagonistic forces of nature for the purpose of defending, affirming, and broadening life with the aim of conquering and taming these forces, becoming their master or proprietor, is in fact what, in the broadest and most preliminary fashion, we call economy. Economy, in this sense, is characteristic of all living things, of the animal as well as the human world.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that's interesting. And then I wrote down here a couple of other definitions of economics that often float around in academic economics. One of them, the one that I think is actually kind of the operating definition that a lot of people use when they say economic explanation of this phenomenon, is something like explaining human behavior with reference to their greed, right? Like,
Right.
why did you get a job? Well, because you wanted money and
Mm-hmm.
you want to buy things with the money. Or why did you get the job? Oh, because you have a passion for that work. That's not an economic. The second one is not an economic explanation. That's kind of a casual way people use it. That's not really the way economists use it. Another one that's more related to Bulgakov's is the allocation of scarce resources, right? The fact that I have so many things I want to do, I have only so many resources to do it, so I need to pick which things I'm going to use those resources for, and we have a similar problem at the social scale. But another one is spontaneous order theorizing, or theorizing why certain social patterns emerge without anyone planning them, right? without there being a single director saying you work in this job, you work in this job, you work in this job, just people operating in a market economy seems to work pretty well, even though no one's directing it, right?
Mhm,
And the
mhm.
fact that there is some order out of without direction is something that's fascinating, and just theorizing why there might even be order without direction. Um, but that second one, the allocation of scarce resources, I think is related to what he's talking about here, because obviously the one direct, I don't remember if he brings this up. He almost definitely does. The like a biblical reference to his definition of economy that he develops here is what is said to Adam when he leaves the garden, that he's going to have to work for his bread now, as
Right,
opposed to when he's in the garden, right?
right.
And so a while back, I didn't realize this until today that this is related. Like 4 or 5 years ago, I made a blog post about the angel of scarcity, I called
Mm.
it, which is the angel outside the garden with the sword is basically the angel representing the principle of scarcity that we refer to in economics, the fact that you don't have unlimited resources to satisfy your limited or your unlimited wants, right? The fact that you need to work for your bread is sort of reinforced by that angel, that angel making you keeping you in that condition.
Right. Although Bulgakov, like he'll set up these polarities, but as he goes through and continues his argument, he also works toward a resolution of these polarities. Like, for example, the one you talked about with the life and death polarity, he ends up talking about the consumption of food and the way that that hints toward communion. So there's at,
Mm-hmm.
even within the empirical world, right? So even with the empirical world, we have this intake of food that suggests toward the cosmic notion of communion.
Yeah.
And so there's a way in which even within these limitations, it's still always so even within these limitations and even within this notion of scarcity, it's also pointing us beyond that toward the divine pleroma, which is once he gets to, which is what in the second part of chapter 4, he kind of begins to lay that out when he starts talking about the economy as being Sophianic.
Yeah. Yeah, the and I guess in these few chapters he's kind of laying out something similar and sometimes repeating it from different angles. So
Yes.
like when he gets to the point of talking about labor, he's talking about basically those moments in which you succeed to fend off death, in a sense, and those
Yes.
moments in which you succeed to turn this object that is trying to destroy you into part of your subject somehow.
Right. That's really good because that's where you can see, like, when he starts developing his theory of labor, which is like mostly in chapter 3, you can see how he's tying back to what he's talking when he's talking about life and death in chapter 1.
Hmm.
Because ultimately, the ultimate labor that he sees human beings as engaged in is essentially warring on the side of life. Warring against death on the side of life is ultimately what all of our labor
Hmm.
ought to be directed toward.
Yeah, it's real. And in the Didache, right, the first paragraph or whatever the sections are called in the Didache is there's two
Right.
paths, life and death, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And so
yeah,
all of ethics
yeah,
is like follow the life path or follow the death path. One of the
yeah.
things our priest says in catechism is that
Mhm.
most people think, oh, when you have a religious worldview, you have a notion of good versus evil, right? Good versus evil, that's the primary binary. But if you, it's sometimes healthier to think of things in terms of life versus death. We're on the side of life as opposed to death.
Right, because that yes, it is much healthier, and that's because if you're thinking about things in terms of life and death, it makes it harder for you to dehumanize because it's
True.
like you can like a man who you would see as a bad man is still a human being, and by virtue of being a human being, even the worst human being still has something good about them because of their participation in the general goodness of humanity.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's an excellent point, and I would
Yeah.
definitely agree with that.
It sort of reminds me of in economics sometimes we talk about it feels like a lot of times we start from a position of everything is in conflict, everything is a zero sum game. But what a lot of economics is about pointing out places in which people could coordinate that they fail to coordinate in, right? So the fact that in a sense, it's man versus all of the forces of death external to himself, right?
Yep.
But in many cases, we feel that the forces of death are so strong, it's not worth trying to coordinate with another person on the side of life and to save some of that life for ourselves or something like that. Let them descend into death, and that'll help fend me off against. I mean, attacking a neighboring tribe for their resources is
Right.
basically an example of that.
Yeah. And but Bulgakov is interesting because he'll also point toward like the obvious patterns of resurrection that we see, like even
Hmm.
in the empirical world, like all the time.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
which reminded me of like how I remember hearing Jonathan Peugeot one time saying that like it was easy for him to believe in resurrection because he sees the evidence of it all the time. But very few people think that way. Bulgakov clearly does because
Yeah.
he actually points to he points it out. You know, like he demonstrates that pattern in
Yeah.
reality.
That's awesome. Um, the another just thing that I should mention before we move too much on. A lot of chapter two was hard for me to penetrate because I don't know much about shelling, right? But
Right.
it seems like shelling is like this. It was hard for me to understand if he was on Schelling's side or not, just partially
Yeah, he
because I don't
was
know about
essentially
Schelling.
he thinks that Schelling had an important insight that was missing in Kant because he thinks actually he has the same criticism of Kant that John Vervaeke does, which
Mhm.
ultimately he sees Kant he sees Kant's view as solipsistic,
Yeah.
that is essentially detached from the world, and he's praising oh he doesn't he thinks that he doesn't think Schelling gets quite far enough, but he does think that Schelling has some insights that like put man back into life essentially, which is why how it relates back to chapter one,
Hmm.
because he's not because yeah, that's essentially what he's crediting Schelling for is returning man like and trying to return man in the process of like even doing philosophy back so that it's connected to life,
Hmm.
and that it's not this completely disconnected solipsistic kind of exercise.
Yeah, but it's interesting that he focuses so much in philosophy on the subject-object distinction and trying to heal that, because economics has wrestled with that so much over the
Yeah, and he
200 years.
showed right exactly, which is yeah, you nailed it. That's why he goes there, because
Yeah.
that's what he wants to do. Is he realizes that this subject object distinction is obvious. It's at the core of like where Western philosophy has gone wrong. He also throws Descartes under the bus pretty hard too,
Hmm.
right? So it's at the core of like where Western philosophy has gone wrong, and also as you said, and I'll let you speak. You're the economist in the room here, so I'll let you speak to that. It's all. Can you talk to me? So I understand philosophically. I understand why understanding the subject object distinction properly, and essentially like not seeing it as not seeing it as like an absolute duality, but holding it as a polarity um, that allows for the translation or bridging between. But I don't know. I don't quite. It's not instinctive to me why it's important to economics. I know what Bulgakov has said in this text, and I read that part where he talks about it in relation to labor serving as a bridge between subject and object.
Hmm.
And my immediate vision there is I'm a sort of a middling poet. So what I was thinking about when he was talking about that is when I'm making war against the blank page and trying to create a poem, like that activity of writing a poem. I've often said that that I see the vocation of a poet as being a witness. And when I say that because if you look at the concept of witness very deeply, you begin to understand that in order to have an occurrence of witness, there has to be both the witness and the one who is witnessing and the one who is being witnessed. But in that act, it actually crosses over, so that so that the one who is witnessing also it, also is the one. It's hard for me to explain. I'll
Hmm.
just shut up and let you talk about this subject object in economics, because I'm rambling.
Okay, well, I think that it relates to what you're talking about because it's about the idea of a relationship, right?
Yes.
And depending on what exactly you want to study in economics. So if you want to study just a Robinson Crusoe situation, for example, there's a guy on an island and he thinks, oh, I got to survive for the next day. So how much time am I going to spend fishing? How much time am I going to spend looking for coconuts, right? You just have a sort of, he has a model in his head of what the world is like. He has his subjective vision and he makes his choices based on that decision. And for the most part, he just continues on with his vision. Nothing is correcting it or whatever. But when you have two people there, right? You have to model what is in their mind, and they have to model what's in your mind. And then there has to be some sort of mechanism of communication between you for us to understand how the system between both of you works, right? So as
Right.
soon as there's multiple people in the model, then not only does my subjective vision matter, but so does yours, and then whatever the medium between those two things is, which for humans is mostly in the material world, the fact that when I do what I think that you're going to do, right? When I do something based on what I think you're going to do, and when you do something based on what I think you think I'm going to do, we end up in some sort of equilibrium, right? So we end up at an equilibrium market price or something like that.
But I want to, yeah, I agree with everything you just said there. But he's also talking. Part of what he's talking about there is the kind of like dissolution of subject and object that happens in the creative act of labor, and every act of labor is creative in some sense. So, like an obvious example would be like, I tried to use my poetry example failed because I couldn't explain the way I think about witnessing, because I had too many other things going on in the back of my mind. But let's use the example of a sculptor instead, right? So a sculptor in like working a piece of marble to turning it into a sculpture, he is putting himself into
Mm-hmm.
that object. So that object is no longer merely an object. It's an object that has been genuinely like transformed by and bridge through this human subjectivity. It's so the object and the subject work in connection, and the labor is the bridge that allows that.
Mm-hmm.
And he this becomes a really big concept for him, because essentially what he's talking about is he's talking about in the connection to our vocation as human beings, our God-given vocation by as human beings to we can't create ex nihilo the way God does, but what we can do is we can take the potential that exists in unlife, and we can raise it up into participation into life
Yeah.
through
We're
our human
sub-creators,
subjectivities.
basically.
What was that?
That's the being a sub-creator is to
Right.
labor, you
Yeah,
know?
exactly.
Like
Yeah.
when I was in high school and I first heard Tolkien's thing about that, I thought he was like giving out a call to artists, like for people to do world building like he did. But no, he means everything. He
Yeah,
means everything we're up to.
absolutely. Yeah. And you can like it's easy to see this in like it's easier to see it in object it's I like the fact he actually talks about this in terms of doing philosophy and other acts of the mind. Like
Yeah.
he includes them in his it's because it's easier to see this when you use like examples where people are working with their hands. So it's like, yeah, it's easy to see this how labor serves as a bridge between the subject and object when you're talking about like, an artisan carving a violin or something like that, right?
Hmm.
It's pretty easy to see. It's a little bit harder to see it when you're talking about, let's say, Bulgakov sitting down and writing philosophy of economy, but it is still happening in that mental process too, in
So,
that
okay,
mental labor.
in order to help explain this subjective objective thing in economics, I'll
Okay,
do
go for it.
just a little bit of history of thought, right?
Okay.
So, have you ever heard of the water diamond paradox?
Nope.
This is based on a passage from Adam Smith where he says this. This is from The Wealth of Nations, right?
Okay.
He says, the word value, it is to be observed, has two different meanings and sometimes expresses the utility of some particular object and sometimes the power of purchasing other goods which the possession of that object conveys. The one may be called value in use, the other value in exchange. So something like, I value this pen because of what it helps me to do. And then I can talk about the market value of this pen, how much it would get me if I sold it on the market, right? The things which have the greatest value in use have frequently little or no value in exchange. And on the contrary, those which have the greatest value in exchange have frequently little or no value in use. Nothing is more useful than water, but it will purchase scarce anything. Scarce anything can be had in exchange for it. A diamond, on the contrary, has scarce any value in use, but a very great quantity of other goods may frequently be had in exchange for it, right? So he says this, he goes, it's so strange that diamonds are basically useless, but they're the hallmark of an expensive thing, right? And water is probably the most useful thing, the most necessary thing that we need for life, but I mean, it's like pennies, right?
Mhm.
And so this becomes, for a lot of later generations of economists, this becomes this big paradox. They don't know how to solve this technical problem. Adam Smith has his own answer for it, which is actually basically fine, but other people get obsessed with it because they keep thinking of the value of something as part of the object itself,
Mm,
right? If the value of water is inherent in its properties, right? And that is supposed to be reflected on the market somehow. And I'm supposed to try to study the entire economy by the properties of all of the objects that are flowing around in the economy. Then this is a complete paradox. The markets are somehow upside down, right? They don't make any sense, right? And so Marx takes this view pretty seriously, right? And so he's looking for the objective value in labor, right?
yes.
And this is what's famously called the labor theory of value, which Bulgakov talks a little bit about. And so a lot of Marx's theories of surplus
Yeah,
value.
but so where Bulgakov parts ways with Marx is because Bulgakov doesn't see the value of labor purely in the objective mode, and the way Marx does because he's a materialist. Bulgakov essentially says that yes, it is like he essentially says it's incalculable. You
Mhm.
just can't calculate it, but it is where the value comes from. But if you try to subject it to a quantitative analysis, it's not gonna you're gonna fail. You
Yeah.
can't calculate it.
And it's interesting that the one of the problems for Marx is that okay, he wants to measure the value of someone's labor equally, like 1 hour of labor is equal to 1 hour of my labor is equal to 1 hour of your labor. But this becomes a big problem eventually, obviously, because you have different skills than I have. So I can do if I do whatever you do for work, then it'll take me many more hours to do the same thing. So 1 hour of my work is not exactly equal to 1 hour of your work. And
Right.
so it would be interesting to think about how we think of the way that Bulgakov talks about labor and then the way that Adam Smith talks about the division of labor, or many other people other than Adam Smith talk about the division of labor. And what he means by that is not many people working on the same thing, like we all divide up shares of the task, but each one of us takes our own part of the task, right?
Right.
So if it's baking a loaf of bread, right? You need to grow the wheat, then you need to make the flour, then you need to bake the bread, right? So we could have many people doing each one of those tasks, and we would be able to do more. There's more effort in a sense, but to divide the labor means to have someone be a dedicated farmer, someone be a dedicated miller, and someone be a dedicated baker, right? And then he thinks when you do that, and each person is able to focus on their own task better, they have a better understanding of that thing, and then their skill magnifies even greater than if you just shoved more people at it. So
Right.
three people doing each one sharing the load in a sense is going to do 3 times as much work as one person doing each of those things. But if you divide up the labor between those tasks, it'll be more than 3 times the amount of bread that you'll make because each person will be much more skilled. Not only that, they'll understand their environment better and they'll be able to come up with new mechanisms and new techniques that'll help them in the long run, right? So
Right.
there Smith very clearly sees in the division of labor section that there's a connection between what you're doing for work, what you're laboring on, and what kind of knowledge you're building, right? And it took 200 years for economists to pick that thing back up again. That's like considered like a kind of innovation of the 1990s,
Oh,
which is wild. But yeah, and then the subjective side, basically the subjective school of economics, which is associated with many different thinkers, but the Austrian school is one of the main ones.
mhm.
They see themselves as solving the water diamond paradox because you're able to say, oh well, it has to do with exactly which unit of water you're getting, right? I already have so much water, that's why the next unit of water is so cheap on the market, right? But obviously, if you're in the middle of a desert, water is going to be more expensive than diamonds, right? So the fact of who the person is that's buying these things is going to be very important for what their price is going to be on the market, right? So and the Austrian school of some of the earlier figures not so much, but Ludwig von Mises, one of the most famous, is very influenced by Kant, and you can very much tell that he's very influenced by Kant, and he wants to build this economics based on fundamental categories of the human mind in a very similar way to Kant, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't like Mises for a long time, and then when I understood that he was a Kantian, I at least understood what he was up to, right? I
Right.
don't entirely embrace it, but I understand what he's up to now, and I can
Right.
appreciate it better.
Yeah. That's always helpful when you're encountering it always reduces the it always reduces the tension level when you can at least like understand like why someone thinks what they think,
Yeah.
even if you don't agree with them. So yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so the Austrian or subjective answer to the water diamond paradox is seen as the sort of solution, but it's that you still end up with this problem where the people that you're modeling now that are just you get really obsessed with what each person's individual subjective vision is, but then you kind of lose sight of what ties all those people together and
Right,
what
yes.
ties them to the world.
Which points us back to where we're almost to where Bulgakov begins, because the first thing, but strangely enough, the first place he begins is like he first of all he's pointing us toward life as being like the fundamental basis of understanding. And when he talks about life as being a combination of the logical and the illogical, of the
Hmm.
Apollonian and the Dionysian, and like that if you try to have a system, let's say like Mises, right? He said is a Kantian. That's a very Apollonian logical approach. And it may seem correct on its own terms, but you know what? It's by definition disconnected from life because
Hmm.
it's a monocular vision that is only accounting for a portion of what life is, because life is not merely the logical and merely the Apollonian. It is also the alogical and the Dionysian.
Hmm.
And he points to life as being like supralogical, because life does not is a synthesis that includes both of those polarities without obliterating them.
Hmm. Well, where that might come in for later Austrian thinkers, even though this is embedded in Mises to some degree, is a very big focus on the character of the entrepreneur, right? And what actually characterizes someone as an entrepreneur. So Israel Kirzner
Mm-hmm.
is basically famous for developing a vision about entrepreneurs as someone who are uniquely aware of things, but you wouldn't be able to say exactly, they wouldn't be able to exactly, as a technology, say, I'm going to produce good ideas or I'm going to notice important things, right? The entrepreneur is just someone who happens to notice, hey, I could buy low here and sell high here. And then when they do so, it brings the market closer into equilibrium or brings resources more where they're more valued or something like that, right? So there you can basically in a rational choice theory model or a Misesian model just say, what is this person's desires? What do they perceive as their means to achieve those desires? And then they're gonna pick the means which gives them the most of their desires that they can possibly imagine, right? But there becomes a huge question of, well, what if those means don't match the real means? What if their desires change? And then the entire model becomes non-predictive, because what really ends up mattering is where do their desires come from
What if
and do their means actually
what if their
match reality?
desires can be easily manipulated because human beings are not just logical or
Yes, yeah.
reasonable?
Or whether they change rapidly.
Right. So, yeah. No, that's good. That's good. That's good. Um, yeah.
One other thing that I should mention is I'm a big fan of pragmatism as well, like
Okay.
Peirce and William James and stuff like that.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
he
yeah.
gives a couple nods to them in this
Yeah.
pat in these chapters.
Yeah. Another, actually, I mean, I've always seen like, are you familiar with Maurice Blondel, the French theologian?
No.
Okay. So I've kind of seen like to me, like Blondel is kind of like, if you take pragmatism and you like take it to like the next level where it has like a better metaphysics, that's kind of like because Blondel's his 1893 doctoral thesis is called L'Action. And so he's very much like Bulgakov here. It's like he definitely like has no place for things that are just armchair philosophy. It's like
Hmm.
you need to be able to tie things back down to like to earth, to the
Hmm.
realm, to the realm of action, to the realm to the realm of life. And so this is what pragmatism has going for it.
Yeah, he mentions he doesn't mention any of the American pragmatists by name, but he mentions Bergson a couple
Yeah,
times.
Bergson, he
Who I
does.
have Creative Evolution. I've never read it, but the copy of Creative Evolution I have was translated from French by William James, or he at least assisted in the translation. So they
Gotcha.
were in contact with one another and
Right.
recognized each other as having mutually supporting ideas. The one part that reminded me of it was when he's talking about it, a lot of the ideas James focused on in the last 10 years of his life was on whether or not the world was, he calls it the fundamentally one or fundamentally many, right? So what we think of as monism or pluralism. And he goes,
Right.
well, both of those ideas have a lot of intuition to them, right?
Yes.
Because like he says, when you're drawing a pen across a piece of paper, the world has to be fundamentally one in some sense for that to happen, so that all those things can relate. But at the same time, it has to be many for it to make sense to say there was no ink on this paper and now there is, or for me to be able to actually interact with the world or notice all of the differentiation and act in it.
What certainly resonates with Bulgakov, who's Orthodox, and he is thinking
Hmm.
of things through. He definitely has a tendency to think of things through like a Trinitarian lens. Like even
Yeah.
when he's thinking ontology, like he sees that the necessity. In fact, in some of his theological works, like he refers to God as a multi-unity. And that's what the triune God is an image of, is this fact that
Hmm.
you can't just have like you can't it's not one or the other, it's
Hmm.
both simultaneously held together in love, which is why uh that's why First John refers to God as love, because that I mean, I don't want to get into the whole thing about like whether you can name the essence of God or not,
Yeah.
um but certainly um it's certainly a let's call it a definition, if
Hmm.
not an essence.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things that's so frustrating about James, because he says over and over again, like, well, some religions tend to be kind of pantheistic, but those are unsatisfactory. And
Yep.
some, and materialism is essentially radical pluralism. Everything
Yep.
is just a force against another force, right?
Yep.
And that's unsatisfactory.
Yep.
I hope there's something in the middle. I'm not aware of it. And I'm like, and eventually, after I'd read more theology, I'm like, I'm screaming the Trinity at William
Well,
James.
those are right, and those are like, and actually, yeah, those are exactly the extremes we tend to run to, right? It's like, so if we become too abstract, we tend to go toward in a pantheistic direction when we become too abstract in our thinking, and if we become like totally focused on the concrete and the observable, we tend toward
Yeah,
opposite pole of just like materialism, which dissolves into
yeah.
chaos.
Yeah, and
So,
James notices that exact trend, but he doesn't develop further in some sense. That might be because his father was a Unitarian.
oh,
And he's writing in late 19th century Boston mostly, so he's surrounded by
okay,
Unitarians.
that would be, yeah, that would explain it.
Yeah.
That would explain it. So I'll have to see. Sam, if you're watching this video, please comment. I have a I have a friend of mine who's a TLC person. Sam, he has a YouTube channel that's called Transfigured.
Yeah, I've watched some of it.
Okay, okay. Yeah, he's a Unitarian.
Yes, that's
So
right. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I posted the quote that I snipped from the book earlier today. I happened to share that on my Discord right after Sam had just posted posted something. I had to add a disclaimer. This is not this was I just happened to post this at this time, and this is not directed toward you in any way. So
Yeah.
that is very interesting to know, though. And although here's the interesting thing. And so I have Orthodox Jewish friends that I've spoken with. And I think even Sam would be willing to grant the idea that somehow like God is a multi-unity, but that does not dissuade them from still thinking that the Trinity is not And I don't know why. I think that they think that there are other ways of approaching this idea of God as a multi-unity other than
Hmm.
positing the Trinity, is what I would say,
Hmm.
ultimately. So, anyway, completely sidetracked. We're off of the subject of economics. We're going. I'm taking us into the theological weeds, so I'm going to shut up. That's why I'm letting you drive
No,
this
that's
one.
why. No, that's why I appreciate it. But I was going to mention this one part that's very interesting, and it's related to the subjective objective relationship when he talks about knowledge as labor, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And a lot of economists have very much championed the idea of idea production and trying to study idea production in a similar way to that we study industrial production or something like that. And he talks of it as something like your unconscious mind are just swirling thoughts, right? And then your conscious mind is somehow manufacturing more, I don't know, more ready-made or more packageable ideas that can then be replicated and shared with others and things like that, right? But at the same time, you sometimes have to think of you have thoughts completely spring from the unconscious. And I don't know, maybe that's something more analogous to like stumbling upon a clearing or an orchard in the middle of a forest, just like natural fruit that you can enjoy or something, right? So
Well,
that was
yeah,
interesting.
to me, it's actually like to me, there's a connection to the concept of revelation
Hmm.
when that happens because it's like you have this sense, like you know that it didn't like you don't have the sense of it coming from you, like you
Hmm.
don't really know where it came from, and it's just like you stumble upon it. It's like well, it's kind of like the idea of the artistic muse is a similar kind of idea, right? Where it's like it's
Hmm.
an inspiration. It's been breathed into you.
Yeah. Oh, I never noticed that. That's what that means.
Yeah, it's what it is
Yeah.
exactly. It's literally what
That's
it means. It's
awesome.
like literally a spirit or the
Yeah.
spirit has breathed into you. And depending on the work that is created, well, the work that is created will kind of give you some indication of what type of spirit has inspired it, right?
Mhm. And it's interesting that you can have that maybe when you rest too. Like when you rest, other thoughts tend to settle and you can see something in your own mind that you didn't see before. Or or when you're doing something completely unrelated to another thought, when you have another task at mind, you're sort of pulling a certain toolbox out and you're working through it regularly. But when you go off and you start doing manual labor, or labor involved with the world that's not too abstract, then these other things can just show up out of nowhere.
That reminds me, there is actually a part of the text where he actually talks about, I think it's when he's talking about labor, where he talks about inhalation and exhalation.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
I can find that. Hold on a second
Yeah.
here.
No, I guess also we didn't really talk about the difference between consumption and production.
Go for it.
Which the basic way that I would try to summarize it is something like consumption is like the maintenance of life, and production is the extension of life. And that can when you consume, you're pushing off the forces of death, like when you eat, right? You're pushing the forces of death off for the time being, right? And you've
Right.
reestablished yourself in communion with the world, or you've reestablished your life as a part of the world by taking some of that death and turning it into your
So
life.
this actually, yes, and this actually relates to this idea of inhalation and exhalation
Hmm.
too, because it's like, yes, it's like things die, but also the spirit is also breathing things into life continually all the time too. So there's this always there even like in the empirical world, there's this ongoing process of resurrection
Hmm.
by that process of inhalation. Okay, so it's at the beginning of chapter 3 when he's talking about consumption. He says economic life can ultimately be reduced to a metabolic process,
Yeah.
to something like circulation or an alternation of inhaling and exhaling. In the language of political economy, production corresponds to inhalation and consumption to exhalation, which actually maps directly onto. I would say that there's a way that maps on to the life and death, right? Because it's like,
Hmm.
to die is to give up the spirit. So death is connected to the act of exhaling,
Hmm.
and giving the spirit back. But the spirit, where does the spirit go? Well, it goes back to the source, to its own source, and it will
Yeah.
return again.
So sorry, he says production is inhalation.
He says production. He says, let's see. He says that in the language of political economy, production corresponds to inhalation.
Okay.
That's like, so the taking in of breath, right?
Yeah.
Being productive. You're alive. You're producing. And consumption to exhalation. So the only thing that reverses that, the only thing that reverses, this is the interesting bit theologically, the only thing that reverses consumption so that it becomes a, a productive, life-giving process is communion, is the Eucharist.
Yeah, and he brings that up. The
Otherwise,
excellent.
consumption is just a participation in the cycle of death because everything that you eat was once alive.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, but I'm also trying to think of the idea of production as growth too,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Because when you make the statue, like you said, you've imprinted the world, and now your life is in something else. The more you produce, the more you build. I have a house now. My life is something that it wasn't before I built the house.
Well, and decomposing things like literally give off gases, right? So they're like they
Yeah,
actually are physically, literally exhaling
yeah,
and being consumed back into the earth.
yeah, yeah,
But it's not, but ultimately life returns.
yeah. And that was the one thing that I thought was strange about this section is so when people in like basic econ textbooks, a lot of times when they're defining basic terms, they'll talk about consumption, they'll talk about production, but then the third one is exchange, right?
Right. Right.
So that's something that's missing right now. And from looking at the other chapter titles, I don't really see it anywhere else, which is the idea of two people and balancing their consumption and production against one another, or both, or
Right.
like Smith talks about dividing labor so that as two of us, we can be more productive than two of one of us, or something like that, than doubling our own output, right? And that
Right.
when you exchange, when you come into a relationship where you're coordinating and exchanging, you get something more than the more that's more than the sum of its parts. And that's interesting too. And that would help you produce more in a sense.
He actually does talk about he talks about nourishment in terms of exchange,
Hmm.
metabolic exchange. And then in terms of like that interaction between persons, he does talk about the inevitable social element of human economy.
Hmm.
But I don't think he actually it's not something I don't think he actually defines though. I think you're right.
Yeah.
He just
Yeah. So
assumes.
for him, that would somehow, if these are two basic elements, that the exchange would have to be somehow decomposed into those two, which often it really is for practical economic theory.
Yeah.
But it's interesting.
So what did you so what is your as like with your economics PhD candidate hat on? What did you, what did you think of this? I mean, it-
Well,
ultimately, like, was it how did it compare to? It's obviously it's a philosophy of economy, right? So it's not really a book on political economy. It's just
mhm.
it's a philosophy of economy. So he's trying to like establish a foundation that actually could theoretically be used by any number of approaches to political economy. Could take Bulgakov's philosophy here and apply it. So what did you think about this effort? Do you see the utility in it as an economist? How could you see applying it? Um, what's your takeaway there?
Well, I can't see applying it because no one would accept it in any journal. Or no, so I can't see applying it in that sense. But I mean, it's really something that's refreshing to read because um, economics is oftentimes one of the disciplines that's the least liberal artsy. It's the social science that's the least liberal artsy, and that people feel that they can ignore most of philosophy. The program that I'm at, George Mason, is very unique, but it's unique because it attracts a lot of people from the libertarian movement,
Mhm.
right? And so these people have already been reading philosophy in their free time anyway. They're that kind of nerd. So everything, people have come having read John Stuart Mill or whatever, all these other things. So people are already interested in philosophy at the outset, and very oftentimes in religion and religious philosophy too. But yeah, it's a lot more like reading Adam Smith, actually, because Smith, is known as the father of economics,
Mhm.
or one of the he made economics what it is today. But I'm not sure how aware of this you are. He also had another book.
Yeah, he was a moral philosopher.
Yeah,
Yeah,
The Theory of
yeah.
Moral Sentiments,
Hmm.
which came out earlier, and he thought of as the better book, right? He thought of it as his own better achievement.
Yeah.
And his reputation is as, like, the prophet of greed or something like that. Like, oh, greed is gonna, like, everybody's gonna look out for themselves. The capitalist marketplace is gonna be the best thing that ever existed.
Hmm.
And so people think of him as that, as a caricature. If you actually read Wealth of Nations, you find nothing like that in there, right? But when you read the Theory of Moral Sentiments, it's a lot about it's a lot of times associated with his theory of sympathy, and you putting yourself in another person's shoes, and how important that is for judging another person's moral character. And so when these German scholars in the 19th century read Adam Smith, they came up with this idea they called Das Adam Smith problem, right? Which is German for the Adam Smith problem, which is, they were like, these two books, they cannot have been written by the same guy, right? This guy thinks everyone's greedy. This guy, everyone thinks everyone is in love with everybody else. So this doesn't make any sense at all. But those two sides of Smith, like people relating with one another, people understanding the world and understanding each other, and then also interacting with this large objective world and integrating with it, you can start to bridge a little bit of that with the kinds of things Bulgakov is focusing on. It's not I don't think, for a lot of economics, it's not a direct practical problem. Like, a lot of the body of economic thought and body of economic knowledge stands, but it doesn't really know itself entirely. I'm thinking especially of things like game theory here, where a lot of it is about an individual just subjectively maximizing themselves. But when you actually start to look under the hood, you have to make all kinds of assumptions about people relating to one another and relating to the world around them, and how they learn and how they come to know and how they come to survive and stuff like that. So yeah, I've been following Paul since, I guess, 2018,
Hmm.
right? And I've been studying economics since 2016. And I
Okay.
picked up Jordan Peterson in 2016 as well.
Hmm.
And so those have always been kind of parallel paths that every once in a while touch, mostly through Adam Smith. But Bulgakov is, like, really the only person other than someone like Smith that really helps me see these things touch, which
So
is
here's
great.
an interesting thing. Since you brought up Jordan Peterson, I heard Jordan Peterson say in an interview recently that all economists, including the anti-Marxists, are basically Marxists. And there are times in this book when Bulgakov essentially is saying the same thing.
Yeah,
And so it's interesting that Bulgakov had this observation in like 1912. He wrote this in
yeah,
1912. This is like even before the Russian Revolution.
yeah,
Bulgakov was able to see how, like, essentially the spirit of Marxism has dominated all of economic theory.
yes,
And
yes.
and then here's Peterson saying the same thing, and it's like, I don't think I've heard anybody other than Bulgakov and Peterson, like, more than 100 years apart. I don't know that I'd ever heard anybody say that before.
I mean, I've heard other economists call themselves right-wing Marxists, in
Mm,
that they are fundamentally Marxist in the way they analyze the world, as everything is about material, bottom up. Everything is built on some material base,
yeah,
right? But they
yeah,
just come to a position like, oh, I actually think capitalism works better. So
right,
they just have different conclusions with their analysis, but they're still
right,
fundamentally Marxist.
yeah.
And so sometimes that's a false attribution to many economists, and many economists are very self-conscious of that, and
Hmm.
know how to combat against that kind of thought, but
Hmm.
preserve what's beautiful in economic theory, or various bodies of thought. But it's a sort of a knee-jerk reaction. It's sort of your baseline, where as soon as, if someone is trying to explain something, sometimes we call it if I say, if you have a certain proportion of your income that you spend on tea, and a certain proportion on coffee, right? If you spend more on coffee, and then my theory of why you spend more on coffee is because you like coffee better, right? That's a preference-based explanation. But if the reason that you purchase more coffee is because tea happens to be much more expensive than coffee, that's a constraints-based explanation. And so in economics, we're always looking for ways to explain things with constraints, because we ourselves can observe the constraints, so we can measure them.
Yeah.
And then when we see those prices move and we see people's behavior change because of those prices, we can confirm our theory. Whereas you can explain all behavior by just saying, oh, well, they liked doing that or they like doing that. So economists tend to prefer not use, that's funny. Economists prefer to not explain things with preferences, right?
Right.
But at the end of the day, you're talking about human minds. So you have to refer to that at some point or another. And further, in order to explain how people update and how people change their minds and how people respond to a dynamic living environment of other people, you have to start thinking about how people inside their own heads are going to be responding to things, which
So
is,
I think I'm going to ask you that question. So we're going to do more episodes because we've really only covered like parts of the first 4 chapters. And so, and we haven't even touched on the second half of chapter 4 at all yet,
mm,
other than me referencing it briefly. So I would say that, as we move forward, I think I'm going to ask you at toward the end of each episode, I'm going to ask you to revisit that question to see whether you see something that might be able to be practically applied to the world of
yeah, that would
economics
be
today,
great. Yeah.
because I think that's a good question to ask. And I think that's something that, did you read the introduction, which is actually quite good?
I think so, yeah. But oh, by Evtuhov? No, maybe I didn't.
Read the introduction, because the introduction actually is quite good and actually addresses some of this question of like that we're talking about
Yeah.
about whether, how Bulgakov's philosophy of economy might still be relevant to economists today. It does address that to a certain extent, and the answer is like kind of like yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, that'll be interesting. I think that's a good. I think that for our first episode, that's that feels good to me. But I want to give you a chance if there's anything else that you absolutely want to touch on.
No, that was great. I guess the one thing I can mention is there's a paper that I've been working on that I see as a way, I think of it as trying to put Matthew Pajot into economics covertly.
Okay, okay,
And we'll try to publish it in an actual academic journal, because the shape of the ideas comes from reading Language of Creation.
right.
But we're explaining it all in technical economic terms. And it's up online right now. It's called Ideas, Institutions, and Incompleteness. I'm not sure if it's something that you can read as a non-economist or a non-trained economist and get a lot out of it, because we use a lot of like common day examples and stuff like that. But anyway, I'll just throw that out there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And send me the link so I can put it in the description when I post
Okay,
it.
I will do. I will.
So I can put a link to that. And also, it's like, yeah, that's interesting. Lecce Pajot, I think there's some similarity to the way he thinks to Bulgakov's approach,
Yeah.
because I think both of them are wanting to, both of them have a strong tendency. I want to look at these two polarities, and I want to figure out what I can learn by looking at these polarities. And they're
Yeah.
very good at looking at these polarities productively and seeing the synthesis.
Yeah. Yeah. Like
So
when Matthew talks about heaven and earth in what is that? He used a particular word. When he talks about the creator, heaven and earth are at one completely,
yeah,
right? Or there's something that, oh, the meta divine
which is
state.
what Bulgakov is pointing out
Yeah.
here too,
Yeah.
when he starts talking about within the portion that we didn't get to. So maybe that would be a good place to start our next conversation, actually. And we might even be able to bring some of your thoughts from Language of Creation into it too. And we can kind of start there, and that we'll start with that second half of chapter 4 that we didn't get to this time.
And I just realized this is obviously so implicit when we talk about production as being something where you take yourself and you imprint it on something else. Both man being made in the image of God and the incarnation itself are the ultimate acts of production, then, in that sense.
Right.
Is the
Although
creator becoming the
Bulgakov
creator.
does draw a distinction, like he says, man actually, he says man can actually cannot create images.
Hmm.
Only God can. But he
Okay.
does. What does he say? What is the distinction that he draws? He says that we can create. I don't remember the word he uses. I'll have to go back. We'll have to revisit this when we talk about that section, actually. But there's a distinction that he draws between. He doesn't say copy, which is what I want to say.
Hmm.
Maybe he does say copy, and I just don't want to think that's what he says. But
This is
essentially,
translated, I guess, right?
models. We can create models. I think models is the term he uses.
Okay,
So we
okay.
can create like copies or models, but we can't create images,
Yeah.
which
Is
is
this
actually a divine.
is this translated from Russian?
It is translated from Russian.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay. That's right.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yes. Yep.
Cool.
All right.
Great.
Well, I think this was a good first effort. Thank you for
Yeah,
joining
that was a lot
me.
of fun.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Take care.